Yeah, so now finally, after half an hour of us trying to figure out how to record sound,
We did it.
we finally managed to now get there.
Yes.
So this is now the second episode of our book club discussion of Peter Gärdenfors's Conceptual Spaces. Today we'll be discussing chapters 3 and 4, which are about, I should know this, properties and concepts.
Exactly.
So they're both such generic terms that I just keep forgetting what they are.
Yeah.
It's just like as if the chapters are called like stuff and things. I mean, I know like he specifies what it is about, but yeah, I don't know. When I hear those two words,
it's very vague. Yeah.
Yeah, I have to admit, when he also talked about properties, it took me like 20 pages to figure out he's not talking about the dimensions. Somehow I just made that error when reading the first one. And I was like, this really isn't making sense.
Yeah.
And then, yeah.
Yeah, no, I have the same. And actually, I have like, sometimes I feel very lost. And then he brings it back, or for me, it gets brought back through a term I understand, right? And then he's like, oh, it's like a distance metric in Euclidean space. I'm like, oh, you know, oh, that's what we're talking about. Oh, now it makes sense, kind of. Like, not everywhere, but yeah, a little bit.
I also found those, every time he basically gets back to the geometric stuff, I find it way more interesting.
Yeah,
and,
totally.
You know, as we talked about, like before we started recording, I found a lot of this stuff, especially chapter 4, not super interesting. And I don't know, I wonder, but like, I mean, every time when he brings it back to the geometric stuff, I find it much more interesting.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether that's maybe because I'm reading, like in a way, I'm just reading this book, right? And I started this reading with no agenda in that sense, other than sounds interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But I did realize, kind of, especially whilst losing interest in the 4th chapter, that I think the reason why I find some stuff interesting, others not so much, is that I'm not reading, like, so he's writing a book from the perspective of, here's my theory. There are other theories that went before it, and I'm going to say how they didn't work and how my theory does work, etc.
Yeah.
But I don't care about that. What I'm doing is I'm reading this from the perspective, not like intentionally, but I realize I'm reading this from the perspective of, how can I use this in my own research?
Yeah, applied. Yeah.
Exactly.
Sure.
For me, it's just like, oh, here's some interesting ideas. How can I use this? What of this stuff could I, apply directly to my own stuff, which not, and all this kind of stuff. Of course, I'm in that sense reading the book incorrectly, you might say. I don't think there's a correct or incorrect way, but, that's obviously not the book he wrote in that sense.
Sure.
But I think because of that, like the entire argument about intensional and extensional semantics and like the logical stuff, it's like, whatever.
Yeah, a little bit.
But obviously for him, that's super important.
Yeah, and especially for him to ground it in his current time, right? And like, Tversky, I mean, that's the only name I remember, of course, like said this, and like some other guy said that, but I think that's wrong because, and for me, it's just like, whatever, give me the Euclidean space again. Do you remember where you started losing yourself, or like your interest in chapter 4? Because for me, it was very specifically.
Let's see. I'm just flicking through. So chapter 3, I think I actually enjoyed almost. I found it really interesting, actually.
Yeah, same.
Apart from like the beginning was like super technical, and I really had to concentrate.
Yeah.
But then also at some point I realized, like, wait a minute, I don't need to understand all of this probably. But then in chapter 4, let's see. I mean, I have to admit, I think I found almost all of chapter 4 less interesting. There's not like there were obviously some things that were interesting in here.
Yeah.
But I think one problem that I kind of have with chapter 4 is that it's not entirely clear to me how chapter 4 is not just a repetition of chapter 3 to some extent. The interesting stuff from chapter 4, I feel like, was mostly in chapter 3 already, at least from my perspective.
Sure.
So in some sense, let's say chapter 4 wasn't for me.
Okay, well, that's very fair.
But what was your specific?
Well, for me, like when we got to like non-monotonicity, I was just like, I'm sorry. I really don't care. Like, I don't even know fully what it is, I have to admit. And, I guess also a fair thing to say is that timing wise, like I am always kind of pressed for time. So reading this book is kind of just an extra. So, I'm not like, I don't have like enough leisure time to like Google non-monotonicity and stuff like that.
Oh,
but
yeah.
I really started. Because in the beginning,
a monotonic function is just one that like increases like it doesn't go down basically.
Okay, yeah, but why?
And if you look at just like, I mean, if you look at, for example, chapter, I don't know whether he means this specifically, but like at page 130, he has figure 4.6. You can see that the one dashed line goes up and then goes down towards the ends from vase to flowers.
Oh, that. Okay.
I think that's anyway. But yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I have to, like, that's where I kind of was like, because like as you said, I think same for me. Chapter 3 was very interesting. I think for the first half of chapter 4 was still very interesting for me. Because in chapter 3 we kind of talk about these properties, and I feel like they kind of get combined, or like, they become a whole with concepts, right? A bunch of properties becomes a concept. I thought that was kind of cool. Kind of lost me. And then like I thought the experiments actually were kind of interesting, because it's like, oh, I thought he was a philosopher, but they still do kind of experiments. So they have like these shell. So
I didn't read the experiments at all.
Okay.
I skipped that part entirely. Yeah.
I went through it, but like a little unfocused, I have to admit. It's kind of fun to see, kind of, because they use models, kind of to see how they do that. I mean, I can't like give you much detail before you ask.
I won't, because I'm not that interested. I mean, unless, like you say, there's like one specific reason why it is interesting, then I'd love to hear about it. But if you also didn't find it too interesting, then
I mean, for me, I think from I guess the applied perspective, I thought it was fun to see how they create these shells, by like having like a distance, like a curvature measure, like a spread, like a height measure, stuff like that. I thought that was kind of interesting. And then they kind of apply that to like, like that is a conceptual space in itself, but then they transform it to like what humans think of it, because humans don't look at these dimensions like mathematically as like in the same way as mathematically is. Like they kind of transform it already, and then they do that, and then they test it for small, which I thought was kind of cool.
Okay, that sounds kind of interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, that was
Maybe
like,
I should have read it.
Yeah.
Maybe I should have read the text we're talking about.
Yeah, you still can. I mean, it was interesting. I thought that was kind of cool. And they have like these 4 different models they use, like nearest neighbor and 3 others, like this Voronoi, how do you call it again? Voronoi space, which sounds very cool, right? That's like definite third date, like after Mar and the other one, it's Voronoi tessellations. So that was kind of cool. I like the applied, like, not just like theorizing about it and like speculating, but also like testing it. I thought that was kind of cool.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I found kind of interesting about the testing it is that this is a kind of indirect point, but it's something I found slightly difficult about the way he writes this, or about some of maybe the way the theory, even like what the theory is, and that's about. So on page 112 and 13, he has this criticism by Tversky and someone else. Exactly. I love, like, as soon as your name becomes big enough, it's always that person and who gives a shit.
Hutchinson.
See? I mean, I'm sure Hutchinson is a lovely person and a great scientist. But by the way, just very briefly, I find it really interesting here to see in this chapter Marr and Tversky both cited, but both for things that I don't know about.
Yeah, same. Even with Montague, I think that's the same Montague who did like the B paper.
Really?
Yeah, I think so, because it's R.M. Montague, and I think it's. I mean, I didn't check this at all. I just checked like in the back the references, and I was like, oh, I think that's the same. Like Reed Montague. Okay. And I was like, he isn't a philosopher. He did like cool like modeling stuff, but yeah, probably he is.
No, that's not him.
No,
I don't know. It says here Montague R 1974. Let's put it this way. I saw Reed Montague in like 2015 when I was at UCL. I'd be surprised if he was writing books in 74.
Oh, you're right. That's not your birthday.
He didn't look that old. Yeah. He's in phenomenal shape if he was writing books in 74.
Yeah,
publishing them.
That. Yeah, okay, so that's something. Okay, that
that's
makes
just
sense.
Coincidence then, yeah. Anyway, but I just found it really fascinating that Tversky is so famous for his work with Kahneman and prospect theory and all that kind of stuff. And Marr is so famous for, as we talked about last time, his 3 levels. It was just really random seeing like those 2 names cited both in the same chapter, but about something I'm interested in, but not for the reasons that I know both of them.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And I mean, this also, I can't remember who said this, but I once heard someone say something like, one really interesting thing when you meet someone who's like won a Nobel Prize or something is that usually, apart from their stuff they won the Nobel Prize for, they have this entire other career of stuff that's also really cool.
Yeah.
And that seems to be the case here.
Oh, one can I like one quick anecdote? Did you know Einstein never won the Nobel Prize for relativity? He won it for something else.
Of course, Koen.
Oh, I never knew that. I learned that this morning.
No, that was kind of I think the interesting thing there was that I think it was still at least in some circles, controversial when they gave him the Nobel Prize. And I think some people thought like, they're maybe giving it to him for the photoelectric effect, right?
Yeah.
And so that they're keeping the door open for relativity. But then they never gave it to him for that, so I don't know.
Fuck. Okay.
Yeah. But so that was just a random aside that I found really interesting. But the point I wanted to make is that so he has this. So Tversky, I guess, I don't know whether direct. I guess he's not really criticizing Gärdenfors, but more like the general idea or approach. And the one thing that he criticizes it for is this symmetry part, where he says,
sure, yeah,
if you can, like New York and Tel Aviv, or Tel Aviv and New York, depending on how you phrase it, one will seem more similar than the other.
Yeah,
that kind of thing. And that basically, if similarities are determined by the distance, then it shouldn't matter which way around you phrase this.
Mm-hmm.
So to which then Gärdenfors kind of in general, or generally argues that, well, if you're starting with one thing, then that kind of becomes the not the norm, but that becomes kind of the default, and thereby the salience of the different dimensions changes, and therefore you attend to different things, which makes complete sense, right? If you think of New York, you have a very specific image in mind. When you think of Tel Aviv, I don't have a specific image really of Tel Aviv, but other associations, being it just a Mediterranean city. Or
I've never
I'm assuming
been there,
it's, don't know whether it actually is a port city at the coast,
so.
But anyway, that makes complete sense to me. But I also find it slightly difficult because in a way it feels to me whenever it seems to me it's almost the kind of thing that's in principle falsifiable, but not practically. Because you can kind of always come up with something like this. You can always say, well, in this thing, the salience changed. Well, maybe we're using a different metric for calculating the distances. Maybe, there's, of course, some of these can then be refuted, but it seems like there's always this wiggle room whereby the general thing is kind of immune to any criticism because you can always come up with some sort of ad hoc explanation of why it's still true. And I found that a bit difficult.
I had this a little bit when he was talking, I think in the beginning of chapter 4, they talk about it can't be the number of, I think, properties or dimensions you share, because there's an infinite amount of dimensions you always share, right? The piano and a goat or something, they both have 4 legs, they both weigh less
above
than
the ground.
Yeah, you can come up with an infinite amount of things that they. Right. So I feel like you're right. And I was thinking here as well, okay, if you want to have a property, you need to have boundaries, basically, right? Within these boundaries, it will work. And if not, if we can find something that kind of functions or not functions outside, then we have an issue. But you're right. It does seem like it's a vague or broad enough theory that it's hard to falsify.
Again, in some sense, I don't actually mind that much because I'm not reading this book for the theory itself. It's more for the general ideas in there. But it's weird because I think a lot of this, it's difficult for me to judge in some sense because, the parts, especially where he compared it to these other theories, other parts that some of it I didn't read that carefully. Mm-hmm. And a large part of that was because the stuff that I did read carefully, I didn't understand that much because it feels like there was a lot of stuff, background knowledge that I just lack because I don't know much about first order logic and semantics and all this kind of stuff. So in some sense, it's, I guess, difficult for me to really evaluate the value of the theory that he proposes in here.
Okay, yeah.
But this was one thing that kind of jumped out to me a bit where,
I get it. It's easy. And I think one thing I realized while reading it is because, when you read it, it's his arguments make sense, right? But that's you have to remind yourself you're reading his arguments, right? Because he even says at some point, I don't have enough space to fully argue, which is very fair, right?
Sometimes he even said this isn't even developed properly at some point in chapter 3 or 4.
Okay,
he actually says at some point, in this aspect, this theory isn't developed properly, so we can't really say too much about this or something. So he just
okay, yeah, that's very fair.
Includes stuff like that.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Shall we maybe do a little dive into chapter 3 into what properties are? Because I thought that was kind of as it was kind of developing in my head, right? I kind of liked it.
Sure.
And maybe one thing is because he always seems to use the same examples. I sometimes wonder because he has the color spectrum. I guess, sorry, I'm doing two things now, but that the examples came up. He either uses the color spectrum as like, a very solid example of, his conceptual spaces, or he uses birds and emus. So I didn't have enough time, but I was like kind of on the bike, like trying to like think of other things that would fit his theory, and I couldn't come up with any. But I guess that's more my fault.
But doesn't in principle anything fit the theory?
I guess. I mean, that's his idea, of course.
Or to which, to what example do you mean? Because sometimes you could think of anything, right? Like you can think of some two personality traits, and you can see how similar two people are by calculating the distance between them, and that stuff works. Or do you mean something more specific? Or...
Yeah, no, I mean like because like the visual or like the color dimension, like the this chromatic thing,
the color wheel,
color wheel plus then the other axes. That is so perfect for such a perfect example. But I was wondering, are there any like this is like the stereotypical or the prototypical example of his theory, kind of, right?
Although I think not actually. I think the reason he uses it is because. So the way I understood that is that he uses the color spectrum as an example of something that's difficult to explain with other parts, or to show some difficulties maybe even when using his theory. Because you have, because as we discussed last time, the interesting thing about the color spectrum is that the circle is that we perceive it as a circle rather than a linear increase in color or whatever it might be, right? Mm-hmm. The way we would with heat, well, I guess heat is a bad example because I think there's some receptors that respond to cold and heat or something like that.
Yeah, so it's probably not linear or like whatever. Yeah, but
anyway, but yeah, it's not like a continuous dimension, but it's one that's circular. So therefore, these distance calculations become more complicated because he used this example where you go. Wait, let me see which figure that is, so I'm not too vague. On page 72, figure 3.5, use this as like a possible counterexample. The title is Possible Counterexamples of the Convexity of Color, where he goes through red, but you go kind of through the gray part in the middle. Mm-hmm. And I think he uses that to kind of say like, that color might seem like an example that doesn't fit his theory. But then he finds a handy way around that problem.
Yeah, sure. No, I mean,
which I agree with, though. If your thing is circular, then don't use I don't know.
You can't use like Euclidean or like not in this way. Yeah, you're right. Totally. I mean, but still, I still feel like it's like a prototypical example of where his theory works out. Like, I mean, and then it's not me like shitting on it, not at all. But I was wondering, is there anything that fits as well, kind of, that has, these multiple dimensions, kind of, and like, I don't think, not like in such a solid example that this that has these kind of components that all belong to the same thing, kind of. I don't know. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, I think one reason why he uses color is because so one thing I noticed once while reading something, someone used all sorts of examples, and at some point you get disoriented because it's just so many different things. You just want kind of one example to go through. I think, the one thing that I did quite like in chapter 4 is this example of skin color, of how,
true,
if you say someone has white skin or whatever, it doesn't mean it's literally white. Yeah. And instead what he kind of has, he has this, what is it called? The spindle of color. And then basically when you talk about certain thing, you just take, basically you copy that version in centered around, let's say, the average of that thing or something like that, right? So that then it's this reference dependence that he talks about a lot, that I'm also interested in, that I found kind of cool. It's kind of that these concepts are not evaluated like absolutely, but relative to the context in which you're talking about them. In this case, skin color, or hair color, or whatever it might be. Yeah. And I guess color is also cool because it applies to so many things.
And I guess the one good thing is that it's very visual, like literally.
Yeah, and that. Yeah.
As an example, like that, because that's, for me, that's kind of what grounds me. I said this in the beginning, I think. The visual examples, so thinking about, the Euclidean space, which is, three-dimensional, it kind of like brings me back, when we get to these small drawings, it's like, okay, yeah, this is what we're talking, kind of like, so I guess it makes sense. Yeah, no, and I actually quite like most of the figures, actually. I think they're simple, but they actually aid understanding. Yeah, they serve their purpose really well. You're right, yeah.
I mean, if you have something, you can just start.
So what I really liked about chapter 3 is kind of how he starts building up the two, like, these properties. And in the beginning, it seems kind of vague. I mean, I think you said as well, like the first couple of pages, you're really like, it was like kind of like a struggle to get through it a little bit, like, right? Because like where we...
It was just the background on the other theories also.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. What's the point we're getting to, kind of? And then all of a sudden, like, it starts to make sense. You get to these examples where you talk about, like, this convexity, connected and disconnected, blah, blah, blah. And then, like, it starts to make sense. And then he makes it, like, a little bit less fake by talking about these natural regions of conceptual spaces. I guess I guess that's maybe is like the non-falsifiability, right? Okay, sorry, I'm kind of vague now. Maybe we should just start talking about properties and we get to everything I just got to.
Okay. Yeah, the natural properties, somehow I didn't quite get the point of that, or why that was so important.
Okay, I wrote. Okay, I have to like check my own writing.
Yeah, maybe it was. Actually, here's a related point. That's again a criticism of mine, which is weird because I find this book so interesting and I'm being quite critical now. But one thing I also didn't like, and this actually, I'm just mentioning this because this appears in the natural properties sub chapter.
Yeah,
is this whole like evolutionary argument he brings. And I mean, to be fair, I think I have in general a kind of skepticism about a lot of evolutionary psychology because a lot of it I think is just making up stories.
Yeah, sure.
And some of this goes a bit into this region or whatever you might want to call it. So, and it's in page 70 with natural properties. It's kind of there, but the strong example for me was on page 82. The question is, why does our innate subjective space of qualities accord so well with the functionally relevant groupings in nature? Kind of like, why are humans so good at this?
Mm-hmm.
And why can we conceive of everything as a space and that kind of stuff? And then he says, the answer for me comes from evolutionary theory. Natural selection has made us all develop a conceptual space that results in inductions that are valid most of the time and thus promote survival. And this is, one of those things where I get like, sure, I guess. But it could also not be the case. It's just kind of, I feel like it's a lot of these evolutionary arguments to me they're not even arguments, they're kind of statements that may or may not be true. And it kind of makes sense that it would be, but I'm not really. It's just like I'm only mentioning it because he mentioned it twice. And in each case, it seemed to me a bit like a kind of a way of getting rid of the argument almost by just saying, sure. It's evolution. We're made for this.
Yeah. Why? Because of evolution. Yeah. Yeah. No, I guess it makes sense. I mean, it is always a compelling. I think it's a compelling argument in that, like, we're still alive, right? So the reason we must be doing a lot of stuff must be because we like are kind of, evolved to survive in this world, right? But
not necessarily. I mean, again, I don't know too much about this, but I guess the idea of evolutionary natural selection is just that traits that are useful, traits that increase your fitness, i.e. your ability to reproduce and for your children to reproduce, are more likely to be selected. But like, it doesn't mean that you need this. Like, I don't know, if moving around randomly is in effect a strategy for you increasing your fitness, then that's that, and you'll have that.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean then like that randomness is per se a good representation of nature or something, right? Like,
but he does talk.
I mean, he doesn't go into this that much. I think he just mentioned it as as an aside twice. But I think it's just in general, I have a problem when people use kind of evolution as a reason for something.
Sure.
Because it seems to me that, it rarely convinces me, those kind of stories, because, I guess I haven't thought about this too much either. So
no, but it's fine.
I can't be too specific with my criticism of a lot of evolutionary psychology, but it just inherently seems, kind of like a lazy answer that gets you around actually having to think about it.
Yeah. I mean, what I heard now is that you don't believe in evolution. I heard that correctly.
Look, God, Koen. Look, Koen, I mean.
Yes.
God wrote the Bible.
Yeah.
After creating Adam and Eve, etc. You know the story.
Like the rib and shit,
yeah. Here we are now.
And 4,000 years later. Yeah.
No, it's more than 4.
Oh, okay.
What I'm saying is it shouldn't be in biology books in school. They shouldn't teach this. They should teach creationism. That's a theory.
It's just not enough evidence. Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, good. Now that we've cleared that.
Yes. Yes. I mean, I didn't think about it that much. I mean, I think like the whole idea of these natural properties kind of like we work towards it, right? What is a property? It can have like, I have to like look up a little bit. Like it's properties as stuff is something that objects can have in common, right? So it's like kind of things you can share. Like, I guess like a color or like, I guess I go to color myself.
Because that's the only example.
Yes. And then kind of we talk about these properties a lot, and then like he kind of goes to like this idea of like, properties can be anything at this point, but then we go towards natural properties that are properties that kind of exist in our world, our reality kind of, right? But yeah, it is a bit vague, I guess. Yeah. So I guess I'm also stunted this up myself here a little bit. Like, but what exactly is that? Like, can I get it in concrete terms? Not really. But like anything in our world that's not like an abstract thing. Oh, no, like symbolic, like logic and stuff like that. I think that's something we can't. Like anything physical, anything that's really in our world, that's natural. And like stuff like, I think even like language is not natural. Then maybe language.
I'm not sure. I mean, the one thing it just says is, so I'm not entirely sure what a criterion is actually. But it says criterion P, a natural property is a convex region of a domain in a conceptual space.
Yeah.
So I guess you can have different kinds of regions, but if it's convex, well, it doesn't say if it's convex, then it's natural. It just says natural ones are convex.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's I mean, just like whilst we're kind of fumbling over this, I find it kind of weird how at some point I thought like, yeah, in a way, like there's so much in here that, I mean, I guess we both also just lack the background for this, right?
Like, yeah.
Neither of us knows much about philosophy or logic or semantics or linguistics or whatever.
Yes.
Or anything. But I did feel that sometimes, like, what we kind of should, like, we should almost do this kind of podcast by doing, like, reading 5 pages, then, like, doing research for like a few months.
Yeah.
And then coming back to it, doing the next 5 pages, and then...
I was thinking the
same. There's so much of this where there's just a lot to unpack and to really kind of put into context of actually doing science and thinking about your own stuff. And
totally. I mean, the one thing that always like discouraged me so bad, it's like, this is 2000, right? When it was written, like 2000, I think.
Yeah.
Like that's 20 years of research on top of this. That's like, I don't know how many books, and I don't even get like the 2000s, right? So that's nice.
Yeah. I mean, all you have to do, Koen, is read all the references in this one. And all the reference in those ones, etc.
And all the people that reference these people.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Then you'll get it. It's just like a few million pages of thought.
That'll be my Christmas.
Yeah. Okay, so here's maybe a more specific question that I had, which is, so he mentions on page 6 or 7 that each dimension is embodied with a certain geometrical or topological structure. Which makes sense, right? As we talked about, like some dimensions might be a continuous variable like height or height of whatever, or width. Others might be some sort of network structure if you're talking about family, like a family tree or something like that.
Yeah.
And this is something where maybe we just actually need to understand some sort of math to see whether this makes sense. But I was just curious, can you just combine these? Like completely freely, that you have like, I don't know, you have a 3-dimensional space, but like one dimension is a graph, another is like a circle or something, and the third is continuous, or I mean, I guess maybe so Koen is looking like a deer in headlights right now. So
yes.
I mean, I guess maybe to some extent I can answer that a little bit myself by saying that I guess with the color spindle, as he calls it, you do have a circle and a continuous dimension.
Yeah.
With luminance, but yeah, I don't know. Like, does it make? Because I guess when I always imagine these dimensions, I always imagine them as continuous because it's just easiest to imagine, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah,
continuous dimensions, and then it's really easy to imagine how you move around in that. But I find it a bit harder to do if one is like a graph or something.
I haven't thought about it. I mean, what I was really surprised by in the beginning, because he talks like, I think in chapter 1 or 2, I can't remember. He talks about like graphs as being like, I guess like kind of like a lower dimension of continuous stuff and stuff like that, right?
Can't remember exactly, but okay.
I mean, like it made sense. It made sense that, I mean, yeah, I guess what it was like, how do you represent graph? You can't do like, linear algebra, right? you can do like graph
Graphs
connectedness.
are done with linear algebra.
It's basically, it is basically, you're right. But like, so can't you just have like, kind of like, what would be a continuous field with like holes in it, or like kind of like connected like that?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm wondering, right?
Yeah.
Because you can imagine like a graph, like where you have like you have a 2-dimensional space, and then on top of that you have like circles for graphs. But I don't know. Yeah, and like I have no idea what you do with that mathematically if you want to calculate like distance, because then you have 2 different kind of metrics in there. And what do you do if one dimension is best represented by one and one by the other? How do you combine those kind of calculations to get the distance between 2 things?
I have no idea.
I mean, maybe it doesn't work. Maybe that's where then people just kind of ignore one of it. Well, I don't know. I mean,
I don't know either.
Our confusion is actually a problem inherent to it. I mean, who's more similar? Your tall sister or your short uncle? Right, in a way that is a kind of really weird comparison, right? Where you go like across kind of different dimensions completely.
I guess that's where he then kind of like the salience thing, right? Like what's,
Exactly.
Is it like genes relatedness or like gender or,
Yeah, so maybe like depending on context,
I think so.
You focus on the height or how close someone is related to you or something like that.
But still, it's a good one. We should invite Daniel Bassett.
I want to answer.
Well, let's email her, and she might know. She does graphs, right?
I mean, she's one of the people who does graphs. Yes. I don't think she invented them. But... Yeah, dear Daniel Bassett, we heard you do graphs.
Yeah, can you do graphs on multiple dimensions with like continuous variables as well? And
she probably won't respond.
Can't blame her.
She'll just respond with, I can't really block you in my email, but I automatically send you now to the trash, to the wastebasket, whatever it's called.
Yeah. Every time I read your emails, it feels like I'm having a stroke, but I'm not sure. Okay.
Actually, I guess a lot of this discussion is kind of random because it's more like random thoughts we had while reading it.
Yes.
And another thing that I thought that was actually really cool and that he doesn't really talk about too much, but that to me seemed really interesting, is the idea that, he does mention that properties are useful for reducing complexity, right? Instead of like having to take in everything, you just extract kind of the relevant dimensions, and then based on that, you have a n-dimensional vector which you can use to represent someone. I don't know, and just as he kind of wrote something like that, I was like, that is a really efficient way of storing like information. Like even if you've never met someone, you just go by like the most, depending on context again, you just choose whatever dimension is most relevant, and then you can kind of summarize that entire person across a few dimensions.
Yeah.
And actually many of these things are like super relevant once you think about them, and have been said a lot of other times. But I found it really interesting when he said that. I was like, that is, suddenly you can represent someone with like 3 numbers or whatever it might be.
Yeah, sure. No, that is definitely true. I mean, I like kind of like related. I feel like a lot of this stuff, a lot of humans or science have the same ideas, and we kind of rehash them, right? In like a slightly different context, like RSA, stuff like that kind of, that's, I guess RSA is almost like a follow-up of this, and like, maybe not, but like, it's also like you treat neurons or whatever, or like anything basically as like in playing like a Euclidean space, and like do analysis on that, kind of like on relatedness or whatever, similarity. It's like all like very similar things. You just like put them kind of different context and like make it work like that. But like this overarching interest in a lot of this stuff comes from the same kind of pool or anything like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And in a way, that's, I guess, what he's suggesting people do in general, right? If you have conceptual spaces, you're doing is you know how to measure distance. So now you just put everything as distance.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, like one thing I had whilst, I think actually my first note I had, or the one thing I wanted to mention at the beginning but forgot to mention, is that most of the stuff he writes about, at least the stuff that I find interesting, I've heard of before. Sure, I hadn't heard about like the other theories and blah, blah, blah. But most of the stuff, like when he talks about space and how you can like calculate the distances between these kind of stuff and all that kind of stuff, like I'd kind of heard a lot about this. I kind of know a lot of this already.
Yeah.
But I just realized like he just provides like a, not even completely, but quite different angle of looking at all of this.
Yeah.
And this kind of, it felt like this is really like adding another dimension. to my thinking about this.
Yeah.
And I also find it then slightly disorienting, because it's like you feel like you know something already, but then suddenly it kind of slightly shakes the boundary or the foundation of some stuff you think you kind of know already, by showing like, you can look at it from this entirely other way. But because it's not really, because it does that like repeatedly in like smaller ways here and there, I never really think too much about each of them.
Sure.
But yeah, I found that kind of interesting that as you mentioned, like a lot of the stuff is already, I mean, in a way, a lot of this stuff, when I'm especially trying to think of how I would use this in my own stuff, and I've thought of some very rough outlines of experiments where I thought like, I could do this and this and this with, with some of these ideas. There's super basic stuff in science, right? You just say like, hey, we're just going to represent these things as 2 dimensions and calculate the distance from this or whatever. Or I realized at some point you said, if you have 2 dimensions, you can actually combine them to create a higher kind of dimension from this.
Mm-hmm.
And on page 92, he has this 2 thing where he says like one is more than the other. Then that means it's everything below the diagonal, for example.
Then you can
kind of get this concept of that. And like, that's exactly what we already do when we study like social preferences. If we talk about someone as pro-social, what this means is that this person prefers something when it's close to the diagonal, for example, the identity line, this kind of stuff, right? So like we're already doing all of this stuff that he's kind of talking about, and we're already thinking about all of this stuff, but somehow like the way he just puts it just makes me think again like, now I somehow understand this more, even though I don't really know how.
I totally agree. I think that's also how I've been treating the book. I guess I'm kind of like, I'm trying to understand the philosophical parts. I don't fully, because, I lack background, I lack knowledge, just sheer intelligence probably. I'm just trying to, hey, I'm just trying to like,
I just want to emphasize. Yes.
Yeah. It's like Dinner for Idiots, or what's the movie called? That's why I'm here, right? Just for entertainment.
Anyway,
like I'm really just trying to like get a different viewpoint, and it's actually working.
Exactly.
It's hard for me to kind of vocalize or verbalize exactly what I'm getting, but I am kind of thinking about stuff while reading. And of course, like it's I always tell myself this stuff, like I do want to reread it in a bit and like see if I can get more out of it, which is of course like I know it's going to be very difficult to do this.
I have like 3 books I'm reading right now where I think like I should definitely reread this. Let's see whether I will.
I mean, after our PG, we'll take a year off and then we'll read, right?
I mean, actually, I have to say, like, one thing that I'm, like, I have stuff I have to do for my PhD, right? Like some projects that I need to finish and that kind of stuff. And so it's not as if I have like any specific time where I can say like, I can definitely like do an entire experiment with this stuff or something. Like, I can, but this would be like in a year earliest or something like that. But one thing I do wonder whether I feel like this has like reading this book has in some sense like renewed my interest or a kind of faint commitment I've had to actually finishing the linear algebra course and to also doing more geometry.
Okay, very good.
Because there's a lot of stuff here where I'm like, this is really interesting stuff. It also, a lot of it relates a lot to what I'm interested in.
Mm-hmm.
And I should probably learn more about this because it seems like there's some, like when I'm reading some of this stuff, I feel like, similar to what you said, like I'm not entirely sure what I'll get from this, but it seems like this is an interesting direction.
Yeah, totally. Same. Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I have an unfinished geometry book lying right behind me. I blame COVID or something. No, but I have the same. Yeah, I actually do think that chapter 5 and 6 are going to be a little bit more difficult for us because they're named semantics and induction.
I have to admit, I'm not looking forward to chapter 5.
Yeah.
As I say many times, not necessarily in the podcast, but in real life, linguistics is the most boring thing on the planet.
Yeah, probably. I have to admit. Yeah.
I know it's very interesting, but not for me. And semantics seems like the kind of, I know it's like a really interesting question in principle, but to me it just seems like pedantic and annoying. And I'm not looking forward to like 40 pages of that.
Yeah, no, same. Yeah, no, same. But I mean, we'll get through it. Who knows? We might like we might be converted into like full-on linguist worshipping Chomsky. within like, the next week. I doubt it, but I mean, we'll see. I mean, I'll try to be open. I think, as I just said, I'll try to just try to get out of it what I can and try to be open. So
actually, I just realized the semantics is actually 52 pages.
Yeah, I know it's
and
long.
Induction is only 30 pages. I wish it was the other way around.
Oh God, yeah, we'll see. I mean, like, well, I'll rest my way through it. Who knows? It might be very interesting, right? I just don't know. I mean, just from the title and the subheadings,
I know
I'm
exactly.
like, oh boy.
Yeah, this is gonna be interesting.
And not a lot of pictures.
Oh no!
Come on.
I mean, I have to admit that there were
Peter.
some parts where the pictures got me through it.
Yeah.
It's just slightly boring now, but there will be some graphs soon.
Yeah. Like, I can see like the picture shining through like the back. It's like, okay, yeah, I can do this. And I love the seashell pictures. You didn't even get it. You didn't get that reward.
No, I saw the pictures though.
Oh, okay.
I saw the pictures, and my first thought was, the resolution on some of these is not that great. It looks like it was done with. I mean, I guess it's from 2000, so my idea that it looks like some of these graphics were generated in like mid 90s is probably actually accurate.
It's probably because he even talks about their experiments in 1994, I think.
Oh well, there you go. Yeah, because it does. Yeah,
I mean,
I shouldn't criticize a study for the graphics when I haven't read the study even.
God, it looks like it was made in the 90s. Like, yeah, it was actually. So, yeah, I can't find it now, but I think it was like he said something 1994. He even says like, the great things about these shells is that they can be like displayed on a visual computer, something like that. So that's makes sense.
I mean, I guess we are nearing the end here, but yes. I just have one point that I found was interesting and which maybe goes slightly counter to something I said earlier. So one of my earlier criticisms was that it's kind of difficult to falsify or that it's sometimes a bit vague and that kind of stuff, what the dimensions are, which one is most salient and relevant and all this kind of stuff, right? But one thing I thought was kind of quite cool is, so I kind of had this question, it's like, okay, so how do I know which metric to measure something in? Like when should I use, not which metric, which like measure should I use to calculate? Should I use like metric? Should I use the city block distances? Like which one should I use, right? Because he doesn't really go into it. But then at some point he does actually kind of go into this a bit. And he says that this Moorman, whoever that was, basically suggests that you use your prior knowledge as a scientist, this is like a scientific question, not necessarily how people do it, but it's like as a scientist, how do you know which metric is most relevant? And this Moorman suggested basically that you kind of use your existing knowledge to limit what you have, which I guess is a common thing.
Yeah.
I thought it was kind of interesting. He said like, with color, we know that there are 3 receptors in the human eye. So use that to start off with, and then you can kind of, that actually, in principle, you have this probably very vast space of possibilities.
Yeah.
But through this kind of, I guess what you could call this is just a biologically realistic model then, by using the restrictions from a low level to inform higher level processes.
Yeah.
So I guess as I'm saying this, I'm realizing this is a really basic point they're making, but I did have a go like, that's a good point whilst reading it.
Oh, that's good. I mean, even I think the most basic points are usually the best ones to have grounded, right? Yeah. So, but it didn't fully get what you were getting at.
You didn't?
No, I'm sorry.
Like even the problem with like which metric to use?
No, I got that. But like, I guess that it's just like that you, okay. No, I guess
it's just like, because I guess before I felt like it was slightly, it's just at first it was like, okay, here's all these different ways in which you can calculate distance.
Yeah, sure.
But like, why this one or not that one? Why? Like for example, the city block metric is something I've not really heard of. I mean, I had kind of heard of it, but not really. So I'm like, I'm not entirely sure where this is used or why you would use this, or like when would you use this versus another measure? And all
like
this
that.
Kind of stuff.
Okay. Yeah.
And it just seemed to me that he did kind of it did make me kind of believe that this wasn't just some sort of arbitrary thing where you go, well, let's just calculate it this way and see what happens.
Yeah, sure.
But that he does kind of suggest some sort of path for doing this in a sensible way.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. Enough rambling for today.
Enough rambling, yeah.
Next episode will be about one of my favorite topics, semantics and induction. And we are very much looking forward to reading the next 80 pages about this. So
We might
see you again next time. It's going to be amazing.